Good afternoon and welcome to our event today, co-sponsored by the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. My name is Kelly Blahos and I represent the Quincy Institute, which is a think tank dedicated to changing the stale mindset of the Washington foreign policy establishment in order to pursue diplomacy over a militarized foreign policy and a national security that works in the best interest of Americans at home and towards a sustainable peace abroad. We have a particularly salient topic for discussion today, and I am honored to be opening this program. Since 9/11, subsequent administrations in Washington have justified their counterterrorism policies in Africa by arguing that the US military presence would stave off the proliferation of extremist organizations in places like Somalia and the Sahel. We have watched as existing terror groups have not only grown, but new ones like Al-Shabaab have flourished. In recent times, there have been calls for a recalibration. President Trump actually ordered troops out of Somalia. The French are doing the same thing in Mali. But will Biden's Pentagon reverse course? What is the correct way of approaching these issues? Is military intervention even working? Here to talk about this and other related issues is a stellar panel of experts in the field. I'd like to introduce them all and then turn it over to our moderator, Lizzie Shackelford, to get the conversation started. So with that, I'd like to introduce Lizzie. Lizzie is a senior fellow on US foreign policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and a former non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute. She is also the author of the Dissent Channel, American Diplomacy in a Dishonest Age, which won the 2020 Douglas Dillon Book Award. Shackelford was a career diplomat with the US Department of State until 2017, serving in Somalia, Kenya, South Sudan, Poland, and Washington. For her work in South Sudan during the outbreak of civil war in 2013, Shackelford received the Barbara Watson Award for Consular Excellence, the department's highest honor for consular work. Shackelford's op-eds and commentary have been published in numerous outlets, including the Los Angeles Times, Slate, and Ms. Magazine. Next, we have Alden Young. Alden is an assistant professor of African American Studies and a faculty member of the International Development Studies program of the UCLA International Institute. A political and economic historian of Africa, he is the author of Transforming Sudan, Decolonization, Economic Development, and State Formation. He is currently engaged in 2 research projects involving post-partition conflicts in the Horn of Africa and East African ideas of federation. A frequent contributor to international media outlets such as Al Jazeera, Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Policy, Young is also a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Next, we have Stephanie Savelle. She is an anthropologist of militarism, security, civic engagement, and political culture. She co-directs Brown University's Costs of War project and conducts research and outreach on the US war on terrorism and its costs for Americans and others around the world. She has conducted extensive research also into policing and activism in the favelas in Rio de Janeiro. She has published in the Political and Legal Anthropology Review, the Journal of Global and Historical Anthropology, Smithsonian Magazine, US World and News Report, Axios, and The Nation, among others, and is co-author of The Civic Imagination, Making a Difference in American Political Life. And last but not least, we have Amanda Sperber, who is a multi-award-winning foreign correspondent and investigative journalist with a focus on East Africa. Sperber won the Kurt Schork Memorial Award for her investigations in Somalia. She also won the One World Media Award for her coverage of sexualized violence in South Sudan's civil war. She is a Pulitzer Center grantee, and her work has been published in numerous publications, including The Guardian, Daily Mail, NBC News, The Atlantic, Vice, Al Jazeera, Christian Science Monitor, Foreign Policy, The Intersect, Vogue, The Nation, and many, many more. So welcome everyone to our panelists and to our audience today. I'd like to turn it now over to Lizzie, and I will see you all at the end of the program. So thank you, and take it away, Lizzie.
Thank you so much, Kelly. We are really excited at the Chicago Council to be co-hosting this with the Quincy Institute. Just a quick note, The Chicago Council is an independent, nonpartisan organization, and the views expressed here by the participants on the program are their own. Well, Kelly did a great job setting this up. If the situation of terrorism is worsening or at least not getting better in all of these areas that have long hosted international counterterrorism interventions, what are we getting wrong? What are the impacts of these efforts? And how should the US and other countries respond more effectively to instability on the continent? We've got a great panel here to discuss these questions and more. So I'm going to go ahead and launch right in, but just please keep in mind in about a half hour, we'll be opening up the floor to questions from the audience. So you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom to submit some questions for us to bring to our panelists about halfway through the program. So I will get started. I've got a question I will launch right at Stephanie to start with. You have done some really interesting analysis with the Costs of War Project about the overall impact of US counterterrorism efforts in the region, specifically focused your recent reporting on Burkina Faso and the use of security assistance. Could you share a little bit about what you found in terms of the overall impact of these efforts in the region?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here. I mean, the bottom line is that this has been, US military assistance in the Sahel has been counterproductive. So basically what happened is right after 9/11, the US went into West Africa. At the time, there was very little kind of threat of Islamist militant activity. The exception was there was a small group in Algeria, predecessor of today's Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. But nonetheless, US security strategists were kind of worried about, there was a lot of, even kind of racialized language about, the ungoverned spaces and the kind of dark corners of the map and the US needing to secure its interests through kind of, these tentacles of reaching out to these kinds of places in West Africa and around the world. And so we started setting up the predecessor to what today is called the Trans-Sahara Counter-Terrorism Partnership. A couple years after 9/11, we started doing training and transferring equipment and selling equipment to West Africa. And what we essentially did was set up a war paradigm approach for dealing with the problem of Islamist militant violence when it arose with a kind of militarized strategy. So we kind of shared, and I talk about this as this is a cost of a kind of a US driven narrative around that's kind of driving these post 9/11 wars, not just in Afghanistan and Iraq, but in all these many parts of the world. And what's going on in the Sahel is just kind of a microcosm of this kind of broader phenomenon. And the US has really kind of, pushed and driven this narrative and this way of viewing the problem. And this isn't a kind of a natural or a self-evident approach. There's been all kinds of research on that shows that there are many other paradigms for dealing with the problem of Islamist militant violence. There's, law enforcement. There is, a very kind of fundamentally addressing the roots of people's grievances and why people have anger and resentment against the state and what drives recruitment to these militant groups, right? So you can kind of track the rise, and it goes like this. It's kind of an exponential rise of U.S. security assistance money to West Africa, and the kind of corresponding rise of the military budgets of the governments in the region. So they kind of track along this parallel rise. And what happens is after the destabilization of Mali in 2012, and that kind of had really complex roots, the local governments started kind of deploying their own domestic wars on terror, using US funds and equipment, but the US isn't the central player in amongst Western powers. The French have kind of taken the lead in the counter-terror battle there. But again, the US driven narrative is at the heart of these efforts. And what happened is that in Burkina Faso is that the government has used this approach to basically strengthen all kinds of authoritarian measures like cracking down on freedom of the press and particularly cracking down on an ethnic group called the Fulani. So this is a herding ethnic group. They are they live kind of across Western Africa in the Sahel region, and they traditionally, I actually was a Fulbright student way back in 2004. I lived in Benin, and in the little village where I lived, there was a group of Fulani living on the outskirts of the village, and they were very much kind of treated as like with disdain, kind of as, second class citizens kind of thing. And there's a really kind of widespread tendency to kind of look down on this group and see them as thieves and things like that. And what's happened in Burkina Faso is the central government, which is dominated by the Mossi ethnic group, has used counterterrorism as a pretext for carrying out violence against the Fulani and accusing them of terrorism. And actually, there's been just as many, if not more, citizens killed by Burkina-based security forces as by these Islamist militant groups. The ACLED data shows that. And what happens as a result of all this violence, it's what some people call blowback, right? It's people, the kind of major reason why people are joining Islamist groups today, and this is a huge and growing problem in the region of the Sahel and West Africa, is out of revenge. I mean, they their family member, or their friend, or their village member is killed, and they're joining these Islamist militant groups to, in revenge. And I heard stories when I was in Burkina Faso, like, a small town Fulani mayor was killed. His children, who were very well educated, a nurse and a college student, were so enraged at the death of their father at the hands of the state that they, spent their own money to buy the motorcycle that they needed to join this militant group. And so this was this, for the teller of this narrative, it was a symbol in such an impoverished country of how dedicated they were to joining these groups. And the kind of statistics bear that out, like 70% of people are joining these militant groups out of revenge and anger, and kind of a corresponding lack of state. When you use a war paradigm approach, you're not investing in development, you're not investing in the kind of economic and political marginalization. So many people feel angry at state corruption and abandonment by the state, and a war on terror, is a very convenient way of avoiding addressing those underlying problems. So one of the things that the Pentagon, U.S. security strategists are warning about right now is that West Africa along the coast is going to become the next Sahel. Watch out! We need to prepare and prevent the Sahel from, this crisis from spreading down to the West. Well, that's exactly the same narrative that was used to expand a U.S. war paradigm approach to the Sahel in the first place. And so we, I think, are kind of at a critical juncture, especially in those conversations about coastal West Africa. And, we have an opportunity to do things differently, to not repeat the same mistakes. I think it's really important that we do that. And last thing I'll say is there's a growing recognition of what I'm saying, not just amongst experts, but recently in Congress actually passed a new bill, and this was the subject of a Responsible Statecraft Quincy Institute blog piece just the other day, it's the Trans-Sahara Counter-Terrorism Partnership Program now, which is supposedly this revamped TSTCP that has this kind of growing recognition that development and some of these things that I'm talking about are important. And the jury's still out, right? Well, we have yet to see whether they're going to continue they're going to act on those kinds of promises, or whether we're going to still see a kind of militarized approach at the root of U.S. foreign policy in the region.
It's really interesting what you've laid out is how you take this war paradigm and you overlay it over a series of different complications. So, Amanda, you've recently been in Mogadishu, and you've been looking at both the counterterrorism situation and also the political upheaval. Can you talk a little bit about how U.S. counterterrorism efforts in a place like Somalia intersect with or impact that existing political dynamic as well?
Sure. I think something at the heart of what I got out of what Stephanie was saying that really spoke to me is really the thing with counterterrorism in general, including what the U.S. does. My understanding is pretty limited to East Africa, but and specifically Somalia, but is that when you're carrying out counterterrorism, you're inherently legitimizing the sitting government, even if the sitting government is itself divided, corrupt, and often working with the fundamentalist groups, so that you are saying that you're countering. So when a fledgling government that has little legitimacy and hasn't proved itself to the local population is militarily supported by the US, that then makes the counterterrorism part of their national political process. I was in Mogadishu in April, filing stories on the election. And at the time, it was the peak of the election tension. Though it is possible it will peak again. And at one point, the opposition within the government, so not al-Shabaab, just the legitimate opposition, formally took control over about half of the capital. The opposition was also threatening the African Union, Amisom, the African Union mission in Somalia, because they were saying that because Amisom was protecting the sitting president, Farmajo, that their protection of him was then legitimizing his continued claim to the presidency. So that kind of serves as an example of how a force that's meant to be neutral inherently legitimizes a player that itself is political. I've been in conflict zones and insecure places before, but that was the first time I could really feel the sea change in terms of feeling like we don't know who's in control anymore, and that there was kind of a step into unknown territory. I remember personally feeling pretty scared and also quite angry at everyone involved who had gotten the country to the point, including the foreign actors who had been a part of this, because they were the people that had kind of propped up this government situation to begin with. I guess finally, final point to make would be that in terms of specifics, in Somalia, the US's main focus is to support Danab, who are the Somali special forces, and they're intended to essentially be like a crack team that go out after al-Shabaab. They don't hold territory. Their mission is solely like catch and kill counterterrorism. Danab has managed to stay above the fray in terms of Somali politics, but they're still part of the national army, and so inherently part of the government. And so therefore, their US involvement is still an implicit support of the national government. And also, as the crisis worsens, as political crises worsen, it's only for so long that Danab can stay above this, et cetera. And in terms of optics, the US withdrawing right when the country could have actually used the guiding hand of an apolitical force the most was not a particularly positive look.
Yeah, and on this, so we're seeing that part of the theme that's kind of coming out of this discussion is this, like, the role of outside players and kind of, picking and propping up winners and choosing between, the good guys and the bad guys. And, Alden, I want to ask you about this. We're fighting, and we kind of put this in a context where we are fighting a clear enemy and we're propping up a clearly chosen partner. But these enemies across Africa and elsewhere, I mean, they're homegrown. They're there to stay. We've proven that even with our assistance, governments like the government of Somalia and a similar case in West Africa, they can't defeat these insurgencies. How does that complicate our ability to resolve these conflicts? And are there other ways that we could be approaching this, not from the strictly war paradigm as well?
I think traditionally one of the challenges for the United States and Africa has been that we look at African countries um, primarily through our own lens of interests and priorities or our own imaginations. And so I'm always struck by one of the, there's a line in one of the colonial archives of the British talking about Kenya. And they're saying, if only we could find communists, then we can make the Americans interested in our problems, right? And we could have the same support that they had in Malaya. And so I think this is a problem that we have writ large across the continent, that everyone knows that in order to capture our interests and our attention, they have to find, terrorists, or they have to find now increasingly great power conflict. I was reading one of the documents of one of Sudan's last finance minister, and it explicitly says the only way to get the Americans interested is to play them off against the Chinese. We have to create this idea that there's a competition. And so I think we often find ourselves getting played or chasing shadows in our own imaginations. And we do this in a way that we fail to understand local conflicts, right? We fail to understand nationalist struggles. We fail, as Stephanie was saying, to understand discrimination against the Fulani. In Somalia, we fail to understand. We see al-Shabaab purely through a terrorist lens. We fail to understand which constituencies it represents. We don't understand the length of the conflict going from the end of Siad Barre's regime during the Cold War. We've simply repackaged Cold War conflicts as counter-terrorism conflicts. One of the most egregious examples right now, for instance, is how much support both the United States and France gave to the Dibé regime in Chad. And now there's a kind of consolidation around this military regime, primarily getting its legitimacy from its willingness to send forces to fight things like Boko Haram in northern Nigeria or throughout, into Libya and places like that. But I mean, Idris Deby was killed by the Tobu, who he came to power militarily against before. And so in some ways, we're perpetuating military leadership, military rule in a number of African countries, purely over the fantasy that we're fighting counterterrorism. And another problem is that it prevents us also from doing reconciliation. So we choose good guys and bad guys. We'll say that, so-and-so is beyond the pale. We can't negotiate with him. We can't foster him or her. We can't foster processes of political reconciliation. And it's blowing back in horrible ways for us. For instance, we supported independence in South Sudan with the SPLA, knowing full well that many of these were military leaders who had fought against each other. But we demonized in some ways the northern regime in Sudan to the extent that we didn't foster reconciliation, or we weren't interested in creating civilian institutions that could mediate against men with guns. And so I think this is one of our biggest problems, is we have an over-militarization of our approach to African conflicts.
And I'll just quickly just re-emphasize one of the points you made, which I think has been really relevant to French justifications for involvement in the region, which this is something that a scholar named Alex Thurston has pointed out. But basically, the French say, we need to strengthen these states, these Western African states that were, these former French colonies, and that is the strategy. That's the main goal in French involvement in counterterrorism in the region, and that completely overlooks the fact that these governments are some of the primary drivers of the violence in the first place. So it's a really kind of misguided, unquestioning, just kind of placing of faith in a kind of a, as you were saying, like the good actors, quote unquote, that's what we really need to question.
Mm-hmm.
And we tend to fall. We tend to fall in love with single leaders. So, I mean, many of us fell in love so quickly with Abiy Ahmed, and we had, one of our problems was that the ambassador in Addis Ababa at the time under Trump, he he seemed to be completely taken with Abiy Ahmed's regime, and to allow our chosen good guy is often given a kind of impunity to do whatever they're doing without us questioning whether or not that's really in the interest of the country or in US long-term interests.
I would say we have a fairly narrow lens, and just as you all have said, we have a narrow lens in how we pocket the different players, and we also have a narrow lens in how we look at what the costs are. A lot of the Pentagon's kind of defensive counterterrorism operations in Africa and elsewhere has been that this is very low cost, but it's really only low cost to us, relatively speaking, militarily. Amanda, you've done a lot of reporting on the cost to local communities in some of these areas, particularly in Somalia. Can you talk a little bit about those costs that we're not calculating into our assessment?
Sure. I did a magazine piece a few years ago about the collateral damage in US wars, in the US airstrikes in Somalia that were basically the premise of the story was that even if everyone you're killing is Al-Shabaab, which is certainly up for debate, how are other people that live in these territories impacted? And I found that people had lost farms, that their houses had been destroyed, that the strikes made Al-Shabaab a lot more paranoid. So after an airstrike, they would kind of shake down the community and accuse people of being spies. They would increase recruitment, not even necessarily in terms of encouraging fundamentalism, but they would just start to, if someone's farm was destroyed, they would then tell that person that they then needed to join Al-Shabaab. So I also talked to a lot of young men whose villages had been destroyed, who had fled their villages because the strikes had then prompted Al-Shabaab to try to force them to join. So there's just a lot of something else that struck me as quite interesting is I talked to some other people who'd left their villages because Al-Shabaab had stopped letting them farm because they were saying that they could not cut their brush because the brush was needed to be high in order to hide from the US drones. So there's just all these kind of tangential things that seem tangential maybe to us, but are not tangential in terms of how they manifest themselves on the ground.
And in terms of how, it seems tangential to Americans, and Americans, and people looking from the outside don't fully really understand what we're doing in all of these places, what counterterrorism operations mean, and how they are affected on the ground. Stephanie,
well,
I'd love to.
I think people there also don't necessarily totally understand, which is just to say that like there's a sense of like the U.S. is just, I think everybody I talk to is always sort of says like, we know that the U.S. is going after Al-Shabaab, and kind of actually assumes that the U.S. does have, it sort of just assumes that the U.S. has a positive vision, but it's very clear that like, this is not the way to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, and I think part of why it's hard to understand what the full implications are is because we don't often have a full visual of what these CT operations are. Stephanie, you've written a lot about the different kind of less transparent ways that the United States is launching these, kind of these wars. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those tools are and why we don't have much insight into what they are?
Yeah, and actually I want to write more. I'm still learning about this stuff. It's really a lot of this is really in the shadows. And I think one of the main things that needs to happen is just much greater calls for much greater transparency around some of this stuff. We really need to enable people to hold our government accountable for what it's doing in Africa. Some of these things are defense contractors. Increasingly, I'm learning that they really are at the heart of the militarization of US foreign policy in Africa. We don't know enough about these defense contracting companies, but they're kind of parallels to the ones that we hear about, like KBR that's operating in Afghanistan. And they're building bases, they are supplying, they're doing a lot of the trainings. So we really need to figure out ways to kind of know more about them. We, weapons sales are also a huge a huge mechanism of militarization, and we don't know enough. The Security Assistance Monitor, of course, is doing a great job in tracking some of that. But I'm learning that that really is at the heart of a lot of, like what US service members and contractors are trying to do is sell US made equipment. That's a big way that the competition with Russia and China is playing out too. Like if we can get US weapons into a country, then they're kind of tied to us, and we have to do, like, we can sell trainings that go along with those weapons. And that's how people within the military get promoted, is how many weapons they can sell. There's a program that I've written about called, not me, but there's been investigative journalists who have uncovered a program called the 127 ECHO program. And I've also written about this in the sense that, there's very little known about this. This is a US budgetary authority that allows the US military to kind of accompany African forces in the field and use them as surrogates, essentially, like go, kind of direct raids and be the brains behind the operation. And this is a really kind of under the radar mechanism by which especially US Special Operations Forces are carrying out operations on the continent through things that sound innocuous, like training and equipping and advising and assisting and all the ways that we couch those kinds of activities. So there's a lot more that needs to be done to investigate those programs and how they operate, and introduce accountability mechanisms. And then there's growing CIA surveillance and drone strike capability. There's the New York Times wrote a piece about a base in Dirkou, Niger, which is different from the base in Agadez. And so there's, this is true in Afghanistan as well. The CIA has an important role to play. We just don't quite know exactly what it is.
I'm going to go ahead and turn to our very long list of really interesting questions coming from the audience. They are coming in rapid fire. So my request to our panelists is to try and be relatively brief on our answers. And if somebody's got it covered, we'll move on. But I want to get to as much of this as I can. I actually think, Stephanie, you just did a good job of answering the first question, which was, can anyone explain the value of utilizing covert actions programs to conduct, advise, assist, and accompany operations? And I think that the value is unclear. The cost is a lot of lack of transparency. Anybody have any value to add to that, other than the fact that it can be done rather easily and with very little oversight? That's considered valuable to some. We'll move on to the next question then. All right, we have a question from Stephen Leach. In terms of overarching strategies, the US is supposedly reorienting a great power competition in terms of foreign policy and defense posture. Why does that seem to be delayed in Africa in favor of continuing the CT emphasis? And what are the risks of trying to shift from CT to great power competition in Africa? Who would like to take that? I see Alden nodding his head. Would you like to take a stab?
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, it's very interesting, the idea that we're reorienting towards great power competition, and what exactly that would mean in a context for the United States and Africa. But I was just looking up one of the facts. The United States, for instance, for 3 years under the Trump administration, which you would think would be obsessed with China, didn't appoint an ambassador to South Africa, the largest or second largest economy on the continent. And so great power competition has these implications that we're going to broaden the focus, to economic competition or development, but that hasn't really happened across the African continent. The United States, I think one of the big strategic failures has been a reluctance amongst American policymakers to develop an Africa policy that's actually based on African interests. And the United States' direct relationship with Africa, instead of subordinating it to other interests external to the continent, or for instance, like opening to Sudan. The way in which it was done under Trump was very transactional, and it had a lot to do with questions of Sudanese normalization with Israel or politics in the Gulf region, rather than thinking really about what normalization would be between the United States and Sudan.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have a question for Stephanie here. What is your view of Macron's decision to withdraw half of France's counterterrorism troops from the Sahel?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a step in the right direction, just like the US withdrawing from Afghanistan is a step in the right direction. It doesn't solve the problems that have been wrought by the war and by Western power intervention in these really complex local conflicts. And it's certainly a messy proposition to you know to remove forces. But it's a step in the right direction. France has taken a cue from the U.S. on these counter-terror wars in Africa, I think, and for the French public has really pushed back. Macron has made this decision in advance of the elections there. So just as it's unpopular here, our war on terror, the French war on terror is also unpopular in France, and I think that. It's good that the public is pressuring our governments to end these endless wars, and I think there's much more that needs to be done to really end them, because there's so many ways that they're morphing and changing and continuing, and we need to sort those out and continue to push for accountability. And I'll just kind of add on to that with the great power competition question. It's just the latest justification, really, for American empire. And, you can trace some of these same logics of intervention that are continuing from the Cold War through counterterrorism, now to great power competition, which, by the way, sounds exactly like the Cold War in Africa in a lot of cases. So let's ask the big questions that need to be asked about what are the excuses and the justifications that are driving these kinds of logics of intervention.
We have one very targeted question for you, Stephanie, which is if you have a source for the statistic of 70% of recruits in terrorist groups doing so for revenge. So if you have any where to cite or send somebody to read more about that, you can go ahead and throw it in the chat. A similar question for Amanda about the drawdown of US forces in Somalia. With that reduction of our footprint there, do you see Al-Shabaab advancing its capabilities and capacity as a result of that withdrawal, and what is its impact on Danab and SDF as a result?
I mean, Al-Shabaab's relationship to this Somali government and Somalia is like, sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to explain this. It doesn't matter, because it's so inherently part of the Somalia as a country that whether or not the US is there, Al-Shabaab will be a part of it. And the US, Al-Shabaab has only managed to advance and set up more of a shadow government since the US has been in the country the past 15 years. It just kind of morphs and works around. Being in Somalia, you often, get the kind of sense, as I think one does in many countries, but certainly my experience is just that the Somalis are playing chess while the US is playing checkers. So I almost feel like questions like that are a bit, while they're important, they're sort of not really the point, because the paradigm of the question is itself kind of incorrect.
Yeah, understand. We've got a few questions that come to this one basic point of, is the answer, or is there a strong case to be made that the US should end all of our security assistance and train and equip programs in Africa, as long as they are counterproductive and not being fully evaluated? I imagine all three of you have opinions on that. Stephanie, you wanna?
I mean, yes, let's go there. Yeah, let's just say it, right? Like, let's end these programs. They're not working. They're counterproductive. They're making things worse. I think that there is a mistaken tendency to think of the United States as a kind of a savior. And if it weren't for the US, that the human rights violations of local forces would be even worse. And I think that's a kind of a misunderstanding of what happens when you throw, guns and military equipment and military logics into the mix. I think that we really need to think about using all other mechanisms for foreign policy first. And, the military solutions have to be the absolutely last resort.
We have one question asking if, mentioning that we're spending less than 1% of our defense budget on the continent because we're focusing primarily on these kind of train and assist programs. So we've got a question asking if perhaps the role of the US military in Africa is being inflated either by African states, foreign adversaries, or the media who is selling inflammatory headlines. What are your views? Do you think that it's overblown what our military's role is on the continent? Hold on. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Amanda. No, go.
I was going to say, as a journalist, I sometimes struggle with that because often, I guess, again, just as someone who spends a lot of time like knocking around Somalia, I'll often feel quite ridiculous asking people again and again about their experience with the US military because they have so much other stuff going on. And I feel like it's sort of, like to them, the US military, to people on the ground, not to them, to people that live on the ground, most of the time, their day-to-day lives are not guided in any way by American airstrikes. And so I often feel that my focus on, covering what the America is doing in Somalia kind of then distorts what's happening in Somalia because it makes it seem like the United States military is the center of everyone's universe when it's just sort of a thing in the sky that's kind of causing one of many problems. So I guess that's not an answer to the question as much to say that, I think it's a huge factor in everyone's lives, but at the same time, if you were to go to Somalia, as everywhere, people are concerned about a lot of other things, first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
I think it also plays a
Mm-hmm.
very pernicious role in a way, a lot of African countries are suffering from maybe the worst of all worlds, right? They get a kind of low cost, low intensity, untransparent American military involvement in their countries, right? They don't get these, in a way, they're not getting the huge bases that you might see in Germany or Japan, and and this kind of massive investment in industrial capacity or tech. They're getting military training, recruitment, they're getting influence on who the officers get to become. We see a rise of military intelligence officials in a number of African countries into political leadership roles. In Sudan, the country I know best, there's a huge, even when the US has no official relations or low official relations with the Sudanese government, there's a huge intelligence apparatus operating in the country with impunity. The embassy base is massive. And even questions under sanctions, the questions of who gets dollars. And those dollar relationships, which can be rather small amounts, often determine political and economic power throughout the country. And all of this is being done with no democratic oversight. And so it's being done in the shadows. And I think in some ways that makes the situation even worse. And it's also not very effective. And so the United States has longstanding security partners who actually aren't militarily that effective. So we've seen in the Ethiopian army, a longstanding security partner with the United States, it's not actually militarily that effective in this northern campaign. Or, the US security cooperation with the Southern Sudanese army, only to go into civil war a few years after independence. We're both not achieving goals of stability, and we're not achieving democratic transparency. And so I think Stephanie's right. We need to dramatically rethink our military cooperation in African countries.
So I'll mention that I didn't realize the chat function is not enabled, so the messages aren't going out. But Stephanie has responded about the 70% number, that a lot of it's drawing from what she's been told through her direct research. And she's welcome to share some other sources if the person who asked the question wants to email her at Stephanie_Savelle@brown.edu. I'm going to get through some more of these questions because we have so many coming in. One question it's a pretty short one, but I think it's a hard one to answer. Where have US counterterrorism efforts been ultimately successful? And I'll tack that in with another question that we've been asked, which is, do external observers fail to recognize the other than military operations of the US military in Africa? How they're getting involved in things like providing veterinary care and dentistry work and other things that are supposed to be kind of these non-military roles. So my question with that is, what is the impact of those other than military efforts that the US military is doing on the continent? And are there success stories that we can talk about? I see a smirk on Stephanie, so I might want to go to you first on that.
I was going to say go to Alden first. He's nodding knowingly.
Alden,
I mean,
you wanna?
we play a large role, right, across the continent, and I think one of the striking things is you see how much involvement the international community has. In a place like Sudan, I remember the first time I realized I was going to a meeting of the United Nations and donor-funded aid programs. Or for instance, I've been working with the World Food Program, which is largely supported by the United States through USAID. And they're determining for the Sudanese Ministry of Finance, they're providing a technical system to determine the price of wheat, right? And then they also are determining logistics routes throughout the country. And they have to, occasionally they have to pay off people to make sure their trucks can arrive on time. And they have to try to design food welfare programs for farmers. So I think the US, and both military and non-military, is playing, I think in a lot of countries, very micro roles in terms of determining policy. But again, these aren't often discussed openly, and they're often done under a guise of kind of technocratic management through multilateral organizations, through supposedly humanitarian organizations, and through the military itself in establishing protocols. And I think that one of the problems is that this is not, we can't, both people in the country, as Amanda was saying, there's this kind of sense that decisions are being made by someone out there that's not accessible. In Sudan, they used to call it this idea of a ghost, right? There are ghosts making decisions. We don't know how these things are popping up. And they're not accessible in the United States. We can't really talk about how these decisions are being made.
And I'll just add that, I'm very skeptical of, the kind of military-driven humanitarianism and development assistance, because that really is a militarization of U.S. foreign policy. If it's being carried out by the military, it's very transparent to the people on the ground what's happening and what the U.S. is trying to do. So I think that that's a really misguided approach.
As a former U.S. diplomat myself, I would say that we could leave some of those activities to people who aren't in uniform. We've got a good question here that really relates to current news, which is what recommendations do you have based on the lessons that we've learned in Africa for the calls for military involvement in Haiti?
As a journalist, I'm not allowed to
right. Yes, Amanda, we're not asking to make policy recommendations. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Oh, I don't. Yeah, I mean, I really can't speak to Haiti. I'm sorry.
I mean, we've had a number of interventions over and over again. And so I think before we intervene in Haiti, we have to really think about why this time would be different, and how would we clearly define what our role going in is going to be. And I think the biggest mistake the United States often makes is it has a really hard time dealing with national and subnational struggles, confronting kind of nationalisms. And we're not, and our military is not really designed for that kind of, those kind of operations.
That brings up a question we've gotten in several forms, which is, and this is, we've had questions about Haiti, but I'll take it back to the African continent, which is, how can the Biden administration, and how can any administration engage effectively in some of these locations that are unstable? We've had questions from the audience about, is it possible for us to do non-military activities without a paramilitary presence in places that are unstable? And so that goes to the mechanisms of how can we. But what should be the focus also instead, if we're recommending that we pull away from the military approach?
You know,
We know Amanda's not going to answer that because she's not making prescriptive decisions. So go ahead, Stephanie.
I mean, it's not like you know, the kind of development model doesn't have its problems either. It's not like there's an easy way to say, oh, well, we should do development instead, because that too is kind of fraught, and there's all kinds of ways of critiquing the ways that the U.S. kind of imposes its worldviews, and many other there are many other consequences of those kinds of approaches. But what I will say is, you know, one of the key things is to kind of track the budget and see, you know, the U.S. is clearly conveying a sense of our priorities in relation to Africa when we invest very heavily in what, you know, quote unquote security assistance vis-a-vis other realms of economic aid, and we're communicating like what the solutions to the problems should be. And so when I kind of did my investigation in Burkina Faso, you could see the rise of security assistance in proportion to other economic aid. It was just getting like a higher and higher and higher percentage. And that's what needs to be shifted. That's what needs to kind of, you know, take like start shrinking again in proportion to other economic aid. Not that economic aid is perfect, but just that's a real communication of what we think that some of the solutions might be.
I think Stephanie is completely right on that point, and I think we often underestimate how much governments mirror, particularly governments that need foreign investment or need direct assistance, mirror their own domestic institutions start to mirror our aid priorities. So if we're giving a lot of money to security assistance, we see a growth of the security sector vis-a-vis other institutions in those countries. And I think that's something that we have to be mindful of those kinds of distortions. In Sudan, it was the European Union, their emphasis on, for instance, migrants. And we saw this huge growth of border security forces in Sudan, which the European Union said they weren't supposedly funding, but everyone in Sudan knew that the European Union was interested in catching migrants. And so whether or not they were directly doing it or not, that was how the Sudanese government responded. And so I think we have to be very conscious of those kinds of outcomes. And then as a policy suggestion, and this is something that I think Alex DeWall brought up a while ago, but it's we need to not be afraid of re-engaging in politics, in political reconciliation. And that's often messy, and it means not having good guys and bad guys or completely picking winners and losers, but trying to do reconciliation and peace building instead of, you know, technocratic approaches of military assistance or even human rights or development. We have to admit that these are often political conflicts that we're involved in.
Mm-hmm. I have a question for Amanda directly and specifically on Somalia. Would a complete and immediate US withdrawal and disassociation from Somalia and Amisom be beneficial to the Somalis?
I think it would change the dynamic. I don't know what would be. I mean, I don't know. It's not for me to say, or I don't think for anyone to say what would be beneficial. I think it would obviously drastically change the dynamic. I don't really know what it would look like. Yeah, sorry, I don't really have a great answer to that.
Yeah, we've got someone here asking if a CT expert was invited to give the other side of the argument, which I think is an interesting question to be asking. Right now, we could have invited someone to come and talk about the argument for staying. But I think that we have addressed some of that, which is that this sense of trying to maintain some stability. And I understand that the short-term stability, I think the argument that a lot of us here have been talking about right now is that the short-term stability is at the cost of longer-term progress. But I'd like to hear maybe Stephanie or Alden talk a little bit about this idea of, if we shut up shop tomorrow, there are some implications to that. But what would you say could be, a sensible answer to that argument that right now we need to stay, whether to balance China or simply to maintain a government in place? Because these are the same arguments that we're getting about places like Afghanistan as well.
Right. I was just reading a piece this morning by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a Pentagon-funded think tank, and the author was making the case that even amongst the kind of insider experts, there actually is a growing consensus that what we're doing at least in West Africa is not working. And you can see that recognition in the bill that just passed Congress and some of the language about the Trans-Sahara Counter-Terrorism partnership. So I don't think that we are actually, providing, I don't think that what we're saying is actually a one-sided perspective at all. I think this is actually a consensus perspective. And one of the points that this author was making was that, when we focusing on kind of good governance and economic assistance and things like that, it is a way of addressing some of the underlying grievances that are driving the violence. And I think the main thing really is, can U.S. actions, match those words? Because right now they're good words, they're fine words, but how is it going to actually play out on the ground? And that's where we can't just kind of sit back and watch what's going on. I think we need to get really creative about all the pieces that kind of the momentum that carries forward on its own, and all the things that happen at the that kind of through all the echelons of the actors who are on the ground, including the defense contractors, and the kinds of actions that they're carrying out.
I think that's it's a good reminder, right, that there was the Pentagon that initially was considering the drawdown, and a lot of that pushback came from Congress. So we're running out of time. I want to ask one last question, if anybody's got some short responses to it, which we've gotten from the audience, which is, who or where in Washington will the impetus come from to make this real change to our approach to counterterrorism on the continent?
The Quincy Institute.
I think that is a great plug, yes. Alden?
And I just say, I think it's coming. I think Stephanie is right. The winds are changing, and they've blown across many times, right? One of the problems I think that we have to think about, as those of us who are interested in Africa, is, a place like Sudan went from the US's largest recipient of military aid in the 1980s to being a pariah state, to perhaps coming back. And you see the same dynamic with places like Ethiopia. We can imagine this with Sudan. We can, across the continent, Washington becomes interested for something like CT, and then loses interest, and then develops the next self-interested motive. And I think a lot of it is about coming up with longer lasting relationships that are actually built on proper understandings of our mutual interests between African countries and the United States.
Well, unfortunately, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to quickly add to, I was making a jokey answer, but I think that there's a growing recognition amongst peace groups of the links between the Black community in the United States and the ways that that U.S. foreign policy in Africa is carrying out a kind of a similar repression and oppression and at the root of which is racism. And so I think that those kinds of movements and ideas are really promising, and Unfortunately, there's not a lot of interest in or attention to Africa in the American media. So I think that journalists have a role to play in kind of amplifying some of this stuff. I think civil society has a really important role to play, and all of the advocates who are going into Congress and educating their Congress people about some of these issues. We all on this call probably have a role to play in changing what's going on.
I think that's a great note to end on, and unfortunately we are out of time. So apologies to those questions we didn't get to. Thanks so much to our panelists for this wonderful discussion. I'll pass it back to Kelly.
Thank you, everybody. That was an awesome discussion, very informative and wise. And I'm hoping that not only the Washington establishment is listening, but people inside the Biden administration, because there's just a lot of ideas there I don't think are permeating the bubble at this time. So before I let everybody go, I just want to announce that we have a great paper. The Quincy Institute has an amazing paper coming out by one of our researchers, Matthew Petty, and our Executive Vice President, Trita Parsi, entitled No Clean Hands, Middle Eastern Powers Interventions 2010 to 2020. This is coming out on Monday, and it debunks the belief that the instability in the Middle East can be blamed on a single rogue state, compares the interventions of Iran, Israel, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the UAE over the last 10 years. Got some great data, amazing findings there. So tune in to our website, Quincy Institute, quincyinst.org, and our Twitter feed. And thank you again to our panelists and to the audience. We had a huge audience for this one. And we'll see you at our next event. And thank you to the Chicago Council as well for co-sponsoring.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, guys. That was amazing.